The leather-bound journal landed face down in a patch of buffalo grass, its worn pages fluttering in the Kansas wind like the wings of a creature desperate to take flight, and Jedediah Vaughn nearly rode his horse right over it. It was the autumn of 1874, and the Kansas prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of amber and gold beneath a sky so wide and blue it made a man feel both free and terribly small at the same time. Jedediah had been pushing his roan gelding, a steady animal he called Copper, across the flats for the better part of 2 days, driving a small herd of cattle south toward Dodge City on behalf of a rancher named Elias Holt. The work was solitary and honest, the kind Jedediah preferred, though it left him alone with his thoughts far more than was always comfortable. He spotted the journal when Copper shied sideways and tossed his head, startled by the sudden flutter of pages. Jedediah steadied the horse with a press of his knees and a murmured word, then swung down from the saddle to see what had spooked the animal. He thought it might be a bird with a broken wing. He thought it might be a piece of discarded canvas from a passing wagon. What he found instead was a small book, roughly 6 inches by 4, bound in dark brown leather that had been worn to a soft, pale tan along the spine and corners. A length of thin braided cord was meant to keep it closed, but the cord had come undone, and the pages were open to the mercy of the prairie wind. Jedediah crouched down and picked it up with careful hands. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with hands that looked better suited to handling rope and fence posts than delicate things, but he held the journal gently, the way you hold something that clearly belongs to somebody else. He looked around the empty grassland, seeing nothing in any direction except his small herd plodding forward without him and the occasional hawk circling lazily overhead. There was no wagon in sight, no rider, no sign of anyone for miles. He turned the journal over and looked at the front cover. There was no name on the outside. He hesitated, because a man raised with any kind of decency knows that another person's private writings are not his business. But the prairie was not a kind place to leave something important behind, and whoever had lost this was somewhere out there, perhaps not yet knowing what they had dropped. He opened it to the first page, looking only for a name, a way to return it. What he found was this, written in a careful, slightly slanted hand that spoke of someone who had learned to write with pride. This journal belongs to Lucy Bishop, and if you are not Lucy Bishop, please do me the great kindness of returning it to the Bishop homestead, 7 miles east of the town of Harper Creek, Kansas. Jedediah read the words twice. He looked up at the horizon, turned to look behind him, then back at the journal. Harper Creek was not a name he knew, but Kansas was full of small towns and small settlements that did not appear on any map he had ever seen. 7 miles east of a town he did not know the direction to find was not a simple errand. He had cattle to deliver to Dodge City. Elias Holt was expecting him within the week. He should have set the journal on a rock beside the trail, where the next person passing might see it and know what to do. That was the practical thing. That was the sensible thing. Instead, Jedediah Vaughn tucked Lucy Bishop's journal carefully into the inside pocket of his coat, close to his chest where it could not be damaged by weather or further lost, and walked back to his horse. He told himself it was simply the right thing to do. He did not yet understand that it was the beginning of something that would change his life entirely. The drive to Dodge City took 3 more days. Jedediah delivered the cattle without incident, collected his pay from a buyer named Morgan who smelled of pipe tobacco and whiskey, and stayed one night at a boarding house on the south end of town. He ate a proper meal, slept in a proper bed, and lay awake for a long while with the journal sitting on the table beside him, its presence oddly insistent in the dark. He had not read it. He wanted to make that clear to himself. He had opened it once to find the name and once more near the middle, because a folded piece of paper had slipped out and he had needed to replace it without looking at what it said. He had done so. He was a man of his word, even the unspoken words he made only to himself. But lying in the dark of that boarding house, listening to the sounds of Dodge City doing what Dodge City did at night, which was drink and argue and occasionally fire a pistol into the air in the general direction of celebration. Jedediah thought about Lucy Bishop. He thought about a woman who wrote her own name in her journal with enough pride and enough fear of loss that she had included instructions for its return. He thought about what a person put inside a journal, the things too private for conversation, the feelings too large for ordinary words. He thought about what it must feel like to have dropped it somewhere on the open prairie, to realize it was gone, to wonder where it had landed and who might have found it. He made himself a simple promise in the dark of that boarding house room. He would deliver the journal the same way he had received it, unopened and intact, to Lucy Bishop of the Bishop homestead, 7 miles east of Harper Creek, Kansas. He owed her that much. In the morning, he asked around Dodge City for anyone who knew the location of Harper Creek. The first 2 men he asked shook their heads. The third, an older man who ran a dry goods store and had the knowing eyes of someone who had traveled every corner of the territory, nodded slowly. Harper Creek, the man said. Little settlement, maybe 200 people. Northeast of here, up past the Cimarron. 3 days ride if you're pushing, maybe 4 if you're not in a hurry. 3 days. Jedediah had no obligation waiting for him anywhere. The cattle were delivered, his pay was in his pocket, and winter was still a month or more away. He had time. He bought supplies from the man with the knowing eyes, stocked up on flour and dried beef and coffee, and rode out of Dodge City heading northeast before the morning had fully warmed. He told himself it was simply the right thing to do. The prairie in October had a beauty to it that was honest and unpretentious, nothing like the lush green of spring or the dramatic thunderstorm skies of summer. It was quieter, older feeling, the grasses gone to gold and rust, the light lower and more golden in the sky, the nights cold enough to make a campfire feel like genuine luxury rather than simple habit. Jedediah rode through it steadily, making good miles each day, camping beside whatever water source he could find and waking before dawn to be back in the saddle. On the first night out of Dodge City, with the fire burning low and the stars overhead in their full autumn glory, he broke his own promise. He told himself it was an accident. He told himself he had simply meant to check the inside cover one more time, to reassure himself he had the right homestead name, the right town. But his hands turned the pages without his full permission, and he found himself reading. The first entry was dated March 14, 1874, and it read, "I have decided to begin writing things down because there is no one here to talk to, not honestly, and a person's thoughts need somewhere to go or they will turn back inward and eat her alive. My name is Lucy Bishop. I am 22 years old. I have come to Kansas from Ohio with my father, who is certain that this land will make us wealthy or at least make us fed. I am less certain, but I am here and the sky is enormous and I suppose that counts for something." Jedediah sat with that for a long moment. Then he turned the page. The journal was not what he expected. He was not sure what he had expected. Domestic observations, perhaps, lists of chores and weather reports. What he found instead was a mind. Lucy Bishop wrote the way some people talk when they have been alone long enough that the words come out in a rush, frank and vivid, and occasionally startling in their honesty. She wrote about the prairie with a naturalist's eye, noting the way the light changed over the course of a day, the behavior of the meadowlarks, the particular quality of silence that descended after a storm. She wrote about her father, Hector Bishop, with a complicated love that held both devotion and frustration in the same sentence. She wrote about the hardships of the homestead plainly, without self-pity but without false cheer either. The well that was too shallow. The first crops that had not come in as hoped. The roof that leaked in 3 places during the spring rains. And she wrote other things, things that made Jedediah's chest tighten in ways he did not quite have words for. She wrote about loneliness in language so precise it felt like she had reached through the pages and pressed a hand flat against his sternum. She wrote about watching the road each afternoon for anyone passing by, not because she expected company, but because the sight of another human being at a distance was enough to remind her the world was still large and still inhabited. She wrote about the way the wind sounded at night and how, if you were not careful, it started to sound like voices. She wrote about hope, the stubborn, irrational, persistent kind, the kind that survives even when the evidence against it is overwhelming. He read until the fire burned to coals. Then he closed the journal carefully, retied the braided cord around it, and lay back on his bedroll looking up at the stars. He was, he realized, somewhat undone by a woman he had never met. He rode hard the next 2 days. Harper Creek announced itself modestly, the way most Kansas settlements did in those years. A water tower first, then the dark rectangle of a church steeple against the sky, then the scattered rooftops of maybe 30 or 40 buildings strung along a main street that was wide enough for wagons to pass each other without difficulty, but not much wider than that. There was a general store, a livery, a small hotel, a saloon that was already doing business at 3 in the afternoon, and a post office that doubled as the telegraph office. Jedediah rode through slowly, drawing the occasional glance from people on the boardwalk but nothing more. Strangers passed through Harper Creek often enough that he was not remarkable. He stopped at the general store and asked the storekeeper, a heavy-set woman in her 50s with clever eyes and flour on her apron, if she knew the Bishop homestead. "Hector Bishop's place," the woman said. "Sure enough, you a friend of theirs." "I found something that belongs to his daughter," Jedediah said, aiming to return it. The woman studied him for a moment with those clever eyes, the way people in small towns study strangers, measuring for trustworthiness in a single comprehensive look. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her. She gave him directions that were the kind of directions you can only give when you know a landscape by heart. Follow the east road until the second creek crossing. Look for the big cottonwood that got struck by lightning and still lived. Turn south for about a mile. You will see the house on the left side of a low rise. Jedediah thanked her and bought a small bag of coffee beans for the road home, because he was a man who liked to have coffee in the morning and he was running low. The directions were perfect. He found the cottonwood, half black from the lightning but still leafed out stubbornly on one side, and turned south. And there, on a gentle rise above a flat stretch of grassland, was a small homestead that looked exactly like what it was. A place where people were working very hard to survive and sometimes, on the better days, managing more than that. The house was a simple frame structure, painted white at some earlier point, but now weathered to a soft gray-white that was not unpleasant. There was a barn that looked newer than the house, which told Jedediah something about Hector Bishop's priorities. A kitchen garden ran along the south side of the house, mostly played out for the season but still showing the brown skeletons of what had been a respectable summer planting. A clothesline stretched between 2 posts, and laundry moved in the prairie wind. Standing beside the clothesline, pinning a sheet to it with the practiced motions of someone who has done this 10,000 times, was a young woman with dark hair that the wind was pulling from its pins with cheerful disregard for her efforts to keep it neat. She was wearing a faded blue dress and a canvas apron, and she was looking at the sheet in her hands rather than at the road, so she did not see him coming until Copper's hooves made enough noise to reach her. She turned, and Jedediah Vaughn felt something happen in his chest that he had no adequate framework to describe. It was not a dramatic thing, not a thunderbolt or a rush of heat, or any of the things he had heard men talk about in saloons when they were trying to explain falling in love. It was quieter than that. It was more like recognition, the feeling you get when you see something from a great distance and understand what it is before you can make out any details. He did not know her face. He had never seen her before, but something in him went still and certain in a way it had never quite gone before. Lucy Bishop was looking at him with the wariness that a woman alone on a prairie homestead is sensibly entitled to feel toward a strange man riding up on horseback. She did not flee. She did not call out. She stood her ground beside the clothesline and waited, and there was a quiet dignity in that waiting that matched exactly what he had read in her journal pages. He took off his hat as he pulled Copper to a stop. "Miss Bishop," he said. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady. Her dark eyes held question and caution in equal measure. "My name is Jedediah Vaughn," he said. "I'm a trail rider out of Dodge City most recently. I was pushing a small herd south across the flats about 4 days ago, maybe 60 miles west of here, and I found something on the ground that I believe is yours." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and brought out the journal. Something changed in her face. He watched it happen, watched the wariness shift and the composure fracture just slightly. And in the space of that fracture, he saw relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. She pressed one hand flat against her sternum, the same gesture he had imagined her making when he read her words by the fire, and for a moment she could not speak. "My journal," she said finally, and the 2 words came out soft and unsteady. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He swung down from Copper and walked to the fence at the edge of the garden and held it out to her over the rail. "I found it on the ground. Looks like the cord came undone and it fell from wherever you had it tied. I hope everything's inside it." She crossed the distance between them and took the journal from his hands, and her fingers brushed his briefly, and neither of them made anything of it, but both of them noticed. She held the journal against her chest the way you hold a thing you thought you had lost forever, and she looked up at him with eyes that were bright at the edges in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. "You rode all the way from 60 miles west of here just to return this," she said. "It took 3 days," he said, as if that answered the question, which it did not really. "It took 3 days," she repeated slowly, turning the fact over like a stone, examining the underside of it. "Mr. Vaughn, I don't know what to say to you." "You don't need to say anything," he said. "I'm just glad it's back in the right hands." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved between them, carrying the scent of dry grass and the distant sweetness of the cottonwoods by the creek. Then she said something he had not expected. "Did you read it?" He could have said no. It would have been easier. She would never have known the difference, and he would have ridden away with his conscience intact on the surface and hollowed out underneath. But Jedediah Vaughn was many things, and a liar was not strongly numbered among them. "Some of it," he said. "I'm sorry for that. I was looking for the name to return it to, and then it was later at camp, and I told myself I was just checking the details, but that wasn't the whole truth of it. I read more than I should have. I am genuinely sorry." She was quiet for a moment, and he prepared himself for anger, which was her right. Instead, something in her expression shifted into something more complex than anger, something more curious. "What did you think?" she said. He was not ready for that question. He turned his hat in his hands. "I thought you were the most honest writer I had ever read," he said carefully. "And I haven't read much, so maybe that's not a high bar. But I meant it as a compliment." She looked at him, and then a small, genuine smile crossed her face, the kind that arrives without invitation. "Would you like to come in for coffee, Mr. Vaughn?" she said. "My father will be back from the far field before dark, and it seems the least I can offer a man who rode 3 days on my account." "I would be grateful," he said, and tied Copper to the fence post. The inside of the Bishop homestead was spare but not joyless. Lucy had hung a few dried flowers from a rafter, and a small watercolor painting of a river in Ohio was nailed above the fireplace, faded but still present. A shelf held perhaps a dozen books, which struck Jedediah as a significant collection for a homestead this size, and told him something additional about the family. The kitchen table was scrubbed clean and the coffee was on before he had finished getting comfortable in one of the 2 straight-back chairs. "You said you're a trail rider," Lucy said from the stove. She had pushed her hair back more firmly now, though the wind had done its work and there were still dark strands escaping at her temple. "Is that what you do by trade? Drive cattle?" "Mostly," he said. "I take other work when it comes. I'm not particular about honest labor. I've done fence work, hay cutting, some scouting for a land survey party last spring." "Do you have a home?" she asked, and then looked up quickly, as if she'd heard the question land more personal than she intended. I mean, do you have a place you go back to between work, or do you just keep moving? Just keep moving mostly, he said. He paused. It suits me well enough, though I'll allow it has its lonelier sides. She turned at that, a coffee mug in each hand, and looked at him. Yes, she said. I imagine it does. She set the coffee on the table and sat across from him, and they talked. They talked in the easy and slightly cautious way of two people who have no reason to trust each other yet, but who can feel, even through the caution, that there is something worth investigating here. She asked him about the places he had been, and he described them in the plain, observational way he described most things, but she asked follow-up questions that made him describe them better. He asked her about Ohio, and she laughed a little at herself as she talked about a girl who had thought Kansas would be like Ohio but bigger, and found it was instead something else altogether, something harder and more demanding and also, she admitted, more spectacular in certain lights. Do you wish you had not come? He asked. She thought about it honestly. Sometimes, she said, in the winter mostly, the winter is hard here. But in October, when the light is like this, she gestured toward the window, where the late afternoon sun was coming in at a low, rich angle that made the plain table and the spare walls look almost golden. I think there is nowhere I would rather be. Hector Bishop came in from the field before the sun was fully down, a big man of about 50 with a gray beard and the permanently squinted eyes of someone who spends long days in bright outdoor light. He was cautious about Jedediah at first, which was reasonable, but when Lucy explained the situation, that this stranger had ridden 3 days to return her journal, Hector's reserve broke open into something warmer and more genuine. That is a Christian act of kindness if ever I heard of one, Hector said, and gripped Jedediah's hand and shook it firmly. You'll stay to supper. That's not a question. Jedediah stayed to supper, and then Hector insisted the hour was too late and the road too dark for him to start back, and offered him the use of the barn loft, which was warm with hay and considerably more comfortable than sleeping on the open ground. Jedediah accepted because it was genuinely the sensible thing to do, and not only because it meant a few more hours in proximity to a woman whose words he had been carrying close to his chest for 3 days. He lay in the loft that night thinking about the conversation. The way she laughed when she caught herself saying something unexpectedly sharp. The way her hands moved when she talked, quick and expressive, as if her words and her body were all part of the same flowing sentence. The way she had looked at him when he admitted he had read the journal, not the anger he had braced for, but something more interesting, more searching. In the morning, Lucy was already at the stove when he came in from the barn, and she looked up and smiled, and the smile was straightforward and warm, and unguarded in the early light in a way that made him understand he was in serious trouble. He told himself he would ride out after breakfast. He told himself this was a woman with a homestead and a father and a life that had nothing to do with him, and he was a man who kept moving, and those two facts did not easily combine into anything. He stayed 3 more days. It was not entirely his fault. On the first morning after breakfast, Hector mentioned that the north pasture fence had 3 sections that needed replacing before winter, and Jedediah, who could not comfortably watch someone else's necessary work go undone when his own hands were idle, offered to help. Hector accepted gratefully, and so Jedediah spent that day working fence beside a man who, it turned out, had strong opinions about fence-building methods and stronger opinions about Kansas politics, and was interesting company once you got past the initial reserve. Lucy brought them lunch in the field, a cloth tied around bread and cold salt beef, and 2 apples from a small tree beside the house. She sat in the grass while they ate, and she talked with her father about the winter preparations still to be done. And then she argued good-naturedly with him about a particular passage in a book she had been reading, a novel that Hector thought was too fanciful and Lucy thought was not fanciful enough. And Jedediah sat on a fence rail eating his apple and listening to them with a feeling that was something between contentment and longing. a feeling he recognized as the specific ache of wanting something you have not yet allowed yourself to want fully. That evening, after Hector went to bed early the way men who work from before dawn tend to do, Lucy and Jedediah sat on the front step of the house in the cool October dark and talked in lower voices than they had used indoors. The sky was extraordinary, the way it is only on the open plains far from any town, every star visible, and the Milky Way a broad river of light overhead. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," Lucy said, which was either the most natural thing in the world to say or the most extraordinary, and with her it seemed to be somehow both. He thought about it. "I can't read well," he said. "I got the basics when I was young enough to make my way through most things slowly, but I never had much schooling. That journal of yours, I worked at some of those pages, some of the words I had to guess at from context." She was quiet for a moment. "You still read it," she said. "I did." "That means more to me than if you'd found it easy," she said, and there was something in her voice that made him look at her, and she was looking back at him with the direct, uncomplicated honesty that he had come to associate with her, the same honesty that came through in every line she wrote. "Tell me something," he said. "Fair exchange." She thought about it, looking up at the stars. "I write in that journal as if someone will read it someday," she said. "Not as a secret, more as a hope. That someone will know what this life was like, what I thought and felt and noticed. I always imagined it would be someone I couldn't yet picture, someone I hadn't met." He absorbed that. He looked at his hands, resting on his knees. "I think you would have been disappointed if you'd known it was a trail rider who barely passed the second-grade primer," he said. She laughed, and it was a real laugh, warm and unguarded and full of delight. "Jedediah Vaughn," she said, turning to look at him with those dark eyes that held the starlight. "You rode 3 days across the Kansas prairie to return a stranger's journal to her. I think that says considerably more about a man than whether he sailed through his primers." He looked at her. She looked at him. The wind moved through the darkness around them, and somewhere across the flat a coyote called and was answered by another far away. "Miss Bishop," he said slowly. "Lucy," she said. "Lucy," he said, and the name sat comfortably in his mouth. "I'm not a man with very much to offer. I don't have land or a house or a steady income. I have a horse, a saddle, a bedroll, and about $40 in my coat pocket." "I didn't ask you for anything," she said, but she said it gently. "I know," he said. "I'm saying it because I want to be honest with you the way you're honest in that journal. Because I'm sitting here thinking things that probably don't have any business being thought by a man in my position." She was quiet for a moment, and he was afraid he had said too much, gone too fast, misread everything. But Lucy Bishop was not a woman who left a person uncertain if she could help it. "What kind of things?" she said. He exhaled slowly. "That I don't particularly want to ride away from this place tomorrow," he said. "And I don't have a good practical reason for that, which bothers me. A man ought to have a good reason." She was quiet for another moment, and then she said, "My father has a second field that needs breaking before winter. The ground is still soft enough, but not for long. That is a practical reason if you need one." He looked at her. She was looking back at him with the corner of her mouth turned up in a way that was very different from the cautious woman who had watched him ride up to her clothesline 2 days ago. "That's a very practical reason," he said. "I thought so," she said. He stayed. He broke the second field with Hector over 3 days, working from first light until the early dark, and it was hard and honest labor that left his muscles sore and his mind clear. In the evenings he sat at the Bishop table and ate supper, and listened to Hector talk about the difficulties and occasional blessings of farming the Kansas flats, and listened to Lucy read aloud from one of her books, because she had offered once and he had accepted, and she read beautifully, with expression and timing, and a sense of how a sentence was meant to land. He observed things. He was a good observer, in the way of people who spend a lot of time alone. He observed that Lucy woke before her father every morning and had breakfast begun before he came in, and that she did this not out of obligation, but out of a particular fierce love that expressed itself through doing rather than saying. He observed that she had a habit of pressing her thumbnail to her lower lip when she was thinking hard about something. He observed that she had read every book on that shelf at least twice and made small pencil marks in the margins, little stars and question marks, and occasional underlined phrases. He observed that she talked to the kitchen garden as she moved through it doing the autumn clearing work, low, cheerful observations directed at the brown stalks of spent tomato plants and squash vines, as if they deserved to be addressed. He observed that whenever she came into a room where he was, something in him settled, the way a restless animal settles when it finds the specific patch of ground it was looking for. On the fourth day at the homestead, a neighbor came by, a woman named Clara Enfield from a farm 2 miles to the north. She was a few years older than Lucy, brisk and practical and clearly a good friend, and she looked at Jedediah with uncomplicated curiosity and asked, within 10 minutes of meeting him, whether he was planning to stay. "Mrs. Enfield," Lucy said, her voice carrying a clear warning. "I'm only asking what everyone will ask," Clara said, untroubled. "Harper Creek is not a large town, Mr. Vaughn, and when a man stays more than a night at a homestead where there is an unmarried woman, people notice. I'm not saying it as an accusation. I'm saying it because Lucy is my friend and she deserves someone who knows the territory." "Clara," Lucy said, more firmly. "It is all right," Jedediah said. He looked at Clara Enfield steadily. "I don't have a plan fixed in stone," he said. "I'm not a dishonest man, and Miss Bishop's reputation matters to me. That's about as much as I can say with certainty right now." Clara studied him for a moment, then nodded, satisfied with something in his manner if not entirely with the content of his answer. She turned to Lucy with raised eyebrows that communicated volumes without words, and Lucy looked at the ceiling in a way that meant she was going to have a great deal to say to Clara Enfield in private at the earliest opportunity. After Clara left, Lucy was quiet for a while, moving around the kitchen with a particular focused energy that Jedediah had come to recognize as the physical expression of internal processing. "She is not wrong," Lucy said finally, without looking at him, "about the territory." "No," he agreed, "she is not. I'm not asking you for anything," she said again as she had said before, "but I'm also not going to pretend I don't know what this is." He was very still. "What is this?" he said. She turned then and looked at him directly, the way she did everything, without evasion, without the coy angles that some women used, and that he had always found uncomfortable. "Something I did not expect," she said. "Something that makes the prairie feel smaller in a good way, something that would be very painful to lose." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, which was all the kitchen afforded, and stopped in front of her. He was close enough now that he could see the small amber flecks in her dark eyes and the precise way her breath changed. "I am not wealthy," he said. "I may never be. I have no land of my own. I am a man who knows horses and cattle and wide open spaces. That is what I have." "Jedediah," she said quietly, "I'm listing my deficiencies," he said. "You deserve to have them listed." "You read my journal with great care when you cannot read easily," she said. "You rode 3 days to return something that was not yours to keep. You have worked my father's fields for 4 days with no payment offered or taken. You listen when I talk and you think before you answer, and you are honest even when being dishonest would be easier." She paused. "I am not particularly moved by wealth." He reached out and took her hand slowly, giving her all the room to pull away if she wanted to, and she did not pull away. She looked down at their joined hands and then back up at him. "I think I would like to come back," he said, "if you'll have me." "Come back from where?" she said. "I need to find work for the winter," he said. "Something steady that will keep me in Kansas. I'm not prepared to ask more than that right now, not when I don't have more to stand on. But I would like to know there's somewhere to come back to." Her thumb moved against his hand, the smallest gesture, a confirmation. "There is somewhere to come back to," she said. "Jedediah." He left the next morning, because he was a man with a practical mind and a practical problem, and sitting around a homestead he had no formal claim to help with would not solve the problem. He shook Hector's hand and thanked him for the hospitality, and Hector looked at him with the knowing, measured eyes of a father who has watched and listened and drawn his own conclusions. "You're a decent man," Hector said. "I can usually tell." "I'll be back before winter properly sets in," Jedediah said. "If that's acceptable." "It's acceptable," Hector said simply. Lucy walked with him to the fence where Copper was tied. She had brought him a package wrapped in cloth, bread and salt beef and 2 dried apples for the road, the same as she had brought to the field, and he tucked it into his saddlebag with care. "Where will you go?" she asked. "East, I think," he said. "There's a big ranch operation near Wichita that takes on winter help for the herd. If I can get on there, it's steady work and decent wages until spring." "That is not so far," she said. "No," he said, "not so far." He mounted up and looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and the October wind moved between them carrying that clean, cold smell that is specific to the Kansas autumn, a smell that neither of them would ever fully separate from this moment for the rest of their lives. "Lucy," he said. "Jedediah," she said. He rode. The winter at the Sallow Creek ranch east of Wichita was hard and cold, and paid honestly, and Jedediah worked it with the methodical focus of a man who has a reason to see it through. He wrote 2 letters to Lucy Bishop during those months, laboring over each one with the care of a man who knows his writing is imperfect but sends it anyway. And she wrote back letters that were longer and richer than his own, but that always responded to what he had said, every word of it, so that he knew she had read his difficult handwriting with as much attention as she gave her fine books. She wrote about the winter on the prairie with her characteristic precision, the sound the snow made when it settled on the roof at night, the way the light changed over the flat white fields in January, hard and bright and achingly beautiful. She wrote about her father's health, which had been unsteady since December, a cough that hung on longer than it should, nothing serious yet but enough to worry her. She wrote about the books she had been reading, including one on natural history that she had borrowed from Clara Enfield, and found so absorbing that she had stayed up past midnight 3 nights running to finish it. And she wrote, in the last paragraph of each letter, something personal and quiet and honest that made him read the paragraph twice, and then fold the letter very carefully and put it in the same inside pocket where the journal had traveled. She wrote, "The prairie at night is no less lonely than it was before, but I find I mind it less. I know that is not a poetic way to say a thing. I think you would understand it anyway." She wrote, "I have told Clara about you because she would not stop asking, and she is pleased for me in her direct, unsentimental way, which I find more comforting than a more theatrical approval would be." She wrote, "I have started a new section in my journal. The entries have a different quality now. I notice that I am not only writing what I observe but what I hope. I suppose that is your doing, Mr. Vaughn, though I will not hold it against you." He rode back to Harper Creek in the 3rd week of March, when the first tentative warmth was arriving in the wind, and the prairie was turning that particular fragile green of early spring, the green that looks almost too delicate to survive what the Kansas sky will eventually throw at it. Hector Bishop's cough had resolved through the winter, but it had left him thinner and slower, and he moved around the homestead with the careful economy of a man who has recently been reminded of his own limits. He was no less sharp in conversation, no less interested in arguing Kansas politics, but he tired earlier and his hands shook slightly in the mornings until the day had warmed enough to loosen them. Jedediah rode in on an afternoon in late March and found Lucy in the kitchen garden, turning the soil for spring planting with a spade that was slightly too long for her comfortable use, working through it with characteristic determination. She heard the horse on the road and turned, and when she saw him her face did something open and uncomplicated and lovely, a smile that arrived too fast to be controlled and that she did not try to control. He dismounted and came to the fence, and she came to meet him on the other side of it. "You are back," she said. "I said I would be," he said. "Yes," she said, "you did." He took her hands over the fence rail, both of them this time, and the winter of letters and distance was right there between them and also somehow not between them at all. "I have $230, he said. "Not a fortune, but enough to start something if a man had a place to start it." She searched his face. "What kind of something?" she said. "I looked at a parcel of land on the way in," he said. "Half a mile north of here. It's good grass, good water from the creek. 160 acres under the Homestead Act. I filed a claim on it 2 days ago in Wichita." Her eyes widened. "You filed a claim?" "I intend to build on it," he said. "I intend to have something worth having before I ask what I mean to ask." "Jedediah Vaughn," she said, and her voice was soft and careful. "What do you mean to ask?" He looked at her over the fence rail in the thin March light with the bare spring garden behind her and the wide Kansas sky overhead. "I mean to ask if you will marry me," he said. "Not today, not until I've built something proper. But I mean to ask it, and I wanted you to know that so you could think about it, and so that if your answer is going to be no, you can tell me now and spare us both a long summer of misunderstanding." She was quiet for a moment that stretched just long enough to make his heart beat harder than necessary. "My answer is not going to be no," she said. "But I appreciate that you said it plainly." He exhaled. Something that had been wound tight in him for months loosened. "Good," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Good," she said, and her smile was the same one that had arrived too fast for control. He stayed with the Bishops that spring and summer, working his own claim and helping Hector with the Bishop homestead whenever the older man's energy or health required it, which was more often as the months went on. The Bishop land and the Vaughn claim were close enough that cooperation was natural and practical, and Hector, who was nobody's fool, understood what was happening and made no objection. He had taken to Jedediah with the deliberate, watchful approval of a father who has been careful because he had to be, and Jedediah honored that trust by being exactly who he had presented himself to be. He built a house. It was a simple structure, nothing grand, but it was solid, and he built it with care, using good timber he hauled from a mill 40 miles east and fitted with the methodical attention to detail of a man who understands that a house is not just shelter but promise. He dug a well and found good water at 18 feet. He ran a fence line around the property that was straight and tight, the kind of fence you build when you mean to stay. Lucy came to see it in July with Hector and with Clara Enfield and her husband Thomas, and she stood in the bare front room with its new plank floor and empty window frames and the smell of fresh-cut lumber still heavy in the air, and she turned in a slow circle looking at it. "It needs curtains," she said. "It needs everything," he agreed. "But the bones are good." She smiled and pressed her thumbnail to her lower lip, thinking. "Over there," she said, pointing to the east wall. "That is where the books should go. I'll build a shelf," he said. "I know you will," she said, and looked at him with such uncomplicated certainty that he had to look away for a moment because the feeling it produced in him was almost too large to hold without somewhere to put it. He asked Hector formally in August, sitting at the Bishop kitchen table in the evening after supper with the summer dark warm around them and the sound of Lucy washing dishes in the back of the house. Hector had clearly been waiting for the conversation, and he managed it with a dignity and directness that made Jedediah respect him even more than he already did. "She is the most important person in my life," Hector said. "Her mother passed when Lucy was 10, and it has been the two of us since then. She is capable of making her own decisions, and I would not stand in the way of a decision that makes her happy. But I am asking you directly, man to man, are you prepared for the long business of it? Because love is the beginning, not the sum of it." "I understand that," Jedediah said. "I have thought about little else for the better part of a year. I'm not a man who speaks quickly about serious things." "No," Hector agreed, "you are not." "I will take care of her," Jedediah said. "Not because she needs taking care of, because she doesn't, not particularly, but because that is what you do for someone you love. You show up every day and you do the work and you pay attention." Hector was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and offered his hand. "You have my blessing," he said. For all it's worth. It's worth a great deal, Jedediah said and shook it. He asked Lucy the following Sunday, which was a perfect blue-sky Kansas day in late August, the kind of day that makes you understand why people come to this flat and demanding land and decide to stay. He had taken her out on a walk across his property, showing her the progress on the outbuildings, the small barn taking shape at the northeast corner of the land, and they had ended up at the edge of his property, where the creek ran clear and cold under a stand of cottonwoods that shifted and rustled in the afternoon breeze. He did not get down on a knee, because the ground was muddy near the creek, and also because he was not, by nature, a theatrical man. He stopped and turned to her, and she looked at him with those eyes that always seemed to be seeing clearly whatever else was happening. "Lucy," he said. "Yes," she said, and then, "Oh." And then she laughed, which was perhaps not the conventional response but was so entirely her that it was perfect. "I haven't asked yet," he said. "I know," she said. "But you are about to, and I want you to know that I know so that you do not have to work up to it for as long as you were planning to." He shook his head slowly, smiling in spite of himself. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring, a simple gold band he had purchased in Wichita, not elaborate but solid and real. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I thought we established that in March." "I wanted to ask properly," he said. She reached out and took the ring from him and turned it in her fingers, studying it in the afternoon light. Then she held it out to him, not handing it back but presenting it for him to put on her finger, which he did, carefully, his large hand steady and gentle. She looked at her hand for a moment. Then she looked up at him. "Jedediah," she said. "Lucy," he said. He kissed her for the first time, there by the creek in the cottonwood shade, with the August afternoon warm around them and the water running past over smooth stones. And she kissed him back with the same uncomplicated honesty she brought to everything she did, and the feeling of it was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life, like a word you learn that suddenly makes everything around you easier to read. They married in October, 1 year to the month from the afternoon. He had ridden up to her clothesline with her journal inside his coat. The minister at the Harper Creek Church, a small, earnest man named Reverend Calloway, performed the ceremony with great feeling and some length, while Clara Enfield cried in a way that was completely at odds with her general personality, and that she denied afterward with considerable energy. Hector Bishop stood with a straightness and a particular kind of pride that was the most he had shown publicly in months, and he shook Jedediah's hand at the end with both of his own. There was a small gathering afterward at the church hall. Harper Creek was a community that took its celebrations seriously, because they were hard-won, and because the people who had built this town in the middle of a demanding landscape understood the value of marking the moments that mattered. There was food that the women of the congregation had contributed, and there was music from a fiddle player named Pete Holloway, who could make a fiddle sound like the happiest thing in the world. And there was dancing that went on until well past the point when the children had been put to sleep under their parents' coats in the corner. Jedediah danced badly and without embarrassment, because Lucy laughed every time they turned in the wrong direction, and her laughter made everything fine. They drove home to the Vaughn homestead in the dark of the October night, the same stars overhead that had been there the first night they sat on the Bishop front step and told each other the true things. The house was warm with a fire he had laid before they left for the church, and the curtains were up on the windows, blue ones that Lucy had made herself, and the bookshelf on the east wall held her books, transferred over the previous week. She stood in the front room and looked around at all of it, the fire and the curtains and the books, and then she looked at him. "My journal is on the shelf," she said. "I saw," he said. "Is that all right?" "More than all right," she said. "I want it there." She paused. "I want to remember that you rode 3 days across the prairie to give it back to me. I want to always remember that." "I would ride considerably farther," he said. She crossed the room to him. She pressed her hand flat against his chest, over his heart, which she had never done before but which felt entirely natural, entirely right. "I know you would," she said. He put his arms around her and she tucked her face against his shoulder, and the fire crackled and the wind moved outside against the windows, and the prairie darkness was enormous and the house was small inside it, exactly the right kind of small, the warm and chosen kind. The years that came after had the texture of real life, which means they had both light and shadow, but the light was strong and the shadow was manageable, and the two of them faced all of it together with the same fundamental honesty they had brought to the beginning. The first winter in their own home was a hard one. January 1876 brought storms that kept them inside for days at a stretch, and they learned each other in the close quarters of a small house in the way that reveals either fault lines or foundations. They found, to neither one's great surprise, mostly foundations. They argued about small things, practical things, the best method for preserving vegetables for winter storage, the proper amount of wood to keep in the house versus the barn. These arguments were always brief and always resolved, because neither of them had the temperament for sustained grievance. They had both come to the relationship too honestly to waste time on positions they were not willing to defend fully. Hector's health declined through that second winter. The cough came back in December, and this time it did not fully leave, settling into a deep rattle that frightened Lucy more than she said aloud, though she wrote about it in her journal in terms that left nothing to ambiguity. Jedediah drove her to the Bishop homestead 3 mornings a week through the worst of winter, and he never suggested it was inconvenient, because it was not inconvenient, it was necessary, and that was the end of the discussion. Hector Bishop died in February of 1876, on a quiet afternoon when the storm had paused, and the light outside was the particular cold blue-white of a winter sky between clouds. Lucy was with him. Jedediah was in the barn tending to Copper and the 2 additional horses they had acquired, and when Lucy came to the barn door and stood there without speaking, he knew before she said a word. He went to her, and she let him hold her, and she cried without restraint for the first time he had seen, not careful private grief, but the full and physical grief of a woman who has lost the last of the family she was born into. He held her until the crying exhausted itself into quiet, and then he made tea and sat with her at the kitchen table in Hector's house, and listened as she talked about her father, the whole long, complicated story of a man she had loved with that particular fierce and devoted love that had expressed itself in breakfast made before he woke and fields helped, and health watched over. They buried Hector Bishop in the Harper Creek Cemetery beside a wife he had missed for 12 years, and the whole town came, which was the Harper Creek way. Lucy stood straight through the burial and shook every hand afterward and thanked everyone with quiet composure, and Jedediah stood beside her through all of it, his hand at the small of her back, steady and present. She inherited the Bishop homestead. They discussed it practically and decided that the 2 claims, adjacent as they were, would work as a single operation. They let the Bishop house to a young couple who had arrived in Harper Creek the previous fall and were still looking for their footing, at a rent that was more gesture than income, but that kept the house occupied and cared for. The fields Jedediah worked now encompassed both properties, and the combination of acres gave them enough to be genuinely productive rather than just surviving. The spring of 1876 was kind to them, wet enough for good crops and not so wet as to drown them, and by summer they had a yield that covered the winter costs and left a modest surplus. Jedediah bought 2 additional cattle and a milk cow that Lucy named Agnes for reasons she refused to explain, but that seemed to involve a woman she had known in Ohio. Agnes was deeply opinionated about everything and expressed her opinions loudly and at all hours, and they both found this very funny. Lucy told him she was expecting in September of 1876, in the matter-of-fact way she communicated most important things, looking up from her mending with an expression that was simultaneously calm and incandescent. "You're certain," he said, which was a stupid thing to say, and he knew it the moment it left his mouth. "I am a practical woman," she said. I would not mention it if I were not certain." He crossed the room and sat beside her on the bench, and she put down her mending, and they sat together with this enormous thing between them for a moment, just holding it, the weight and the wonder of it. "Are you frightened?" he asked. She considered it honestly. "A little," she said. "But mostly not. I think we are capable of this." "We are," he said, with a certainty that surprised even himself. Their son was born in May of 1877 in the front bedroom of the Vaughn homestead, delivered by Clara Enfield and the doctor from Harper Creek, who arrived with just enough time to be useful. It was a long labor, and Lucy bore it with the same stubborn grace she brought to everything difficult, and when it was over she held the baby, a solid, dark-haired boy with his mother's eyes already visible in his face, with an expression that Jedediah could only describe later as complete. "Hector," she said. "I would like to call him Hector." Jedediah looked at his son. He looked at his wife. Something moved through him that was entirely too large for words, the particular vastness of realizing that your life is fuller than you believed it was capable of being. "Hector," he said. "That's right." Little Hector Vaughn was, from very early on, a person of considerable views and enormous energy, a combination that kept both his parents thoroughly occupied. He walked early and talked early, and had his mother's habit of asking the questions that other people had not quite gotten around to asking yet, delivered with his father's blunt directness. By the time he was 3, he was following Jedediah around the property like a small, determined shadow, asking questions about everything with the tireless curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to find the world ordinary. Jedediah read to him. He read haltingly and carefully, working through Lucy's books one page at a time, getting better at it with every year because Lucy had quietly, without making anything of it, been teaching him. She had started it almost accidentally, or perhaps not accidentally at all, sitting beside him on the evenings when they read together and reading the difficult words out loud before he reached them, explaining their structure so naturally and so matter-of-factly that it had taken him 2 or 3 sessions to realize she was doing it deliberately. When he pointed this out, she had simply said, "You read to me, I read to you. It seems fair," and that had been the entirety of the conversation. By 1879, he could read with reasonable fluency, and he read to Hector every night before bed, the same books Lucy had read by lamplight in the Bishop homestead, natural history and geography and novels that might be too fanciful or might not be fanciful enough, depending on your position. Clara Enfield came by one morning in the spring of 1879, when little Hector was 2, and the fields were just turning green again, and found Lucy in the kitchen garden looking thoughtful. "You have that look again," Clara said. "What look?" Lucy said. "The same look you had in September of 1876, Clara said. Lucy looked up at her and smiled. "You are alarmingly observant for someone who claims to mind her own business." "I never claimed any such thing," Clara said. "When is the baby due?" "November," Lucy said. "We think." The second child, a daughter, arrived 2 weeks early in late October, small and furious, and immediately quite clearly the person who would eventually be running things. They called her Eleanor, because Lucy had always wanted the name, and because it suited her from the first moment, a name with weight and history and no nonsense about it. Eleanor was everything Hector was not, which is to say quiet where he was loud, careful where he was impulsive, and possessed of a smile that she deployed rarely but to devastating effect. She had Jedediah's coloring, lighter than her brother, and his habit of watching carefully before speaking. She was, her father thought privately, very likely going to be the most formidable person any of them had ever met, given sufficient time. The homestead in those years, the early 1880s, had grown into something that looked nothing like the sparse, struggling place Jedediah had ridden to with a journal inside his coat. The house had been enlarged twice, carefully, practical additions that gave them room without sacrificing the warmth of the smaller space. The barn was solid and well-equipped. The fields were productive and managed. They were not wealthy by any Eastern standard, but they were comfortable and stable, and the surplus at the end of each season went into a bank account in Wichita that grew with satisfying steadiness. Harper Creek itself had grown. The town had a proper school by 1881, which was a matter of great local pride and great relief to Lucy, who had been teaching Hector at home with an admirable but obviously limited patience. The school was a one-room affair with a teacher named Miss Albright, who was 23 and absolutely committed to her students, and who found, in Lucy Bishop Vaughn, an immediate and enthusiastic ally in the project of building a proper school library. Jedediah and Thomas Enfield and 2 other men in the community built the library shelves on a Saturday in March of 1882, Lucy directing the placement of every section with the focus of a general overseeing a campaign. Jedediah worked with the cheerful competence of a man doing something he knows how to do for a purpose he finds worth doing, and when the shelves were finished, Lucy ran her hand along the smooth wood and looked at him with a particular expression that he had come to understand meant something she would write in her journal that evening. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Lucy," she smiled. "I was just thinking that you are a very good man," she said, "and that I am aware of it every day." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was a man who nearly rode over a journal in the grass." "No," she said, "you were a man who stopped and picked it up." He thought about that autumn day in 1874, the flutter of pages in the wind, copper shying sideways, himself crouching in the buffalo grass to see what it was. He thought about the feeling of the leather in his hands, the small surprise of finding words inside that were meant for no one and for everyone. He thought about the campfire on the open prairie, the stars overhead, reading about a woman who wrote as if someone would find her words eventually and need them. "I would do it again," he said. "I know," she said. "That is one of the things I love about you." The journal was still on the bookshelf, the original shelf he had built in the east wall of the front room. It stood between a natural history of the American grasslands and a collected edition of poetry that Lucy had acquired at some point, and that she claimed to read for the meter, but that Jedediah suspected she read for other reasons entirely. The journal's leather cover had worn further over the years, handled and rehanded, moved and replaced. He sometimes took it down and held it, not to read it, not anymore, but just to feel the particular weight of it and remember the morning. He had ridden away from a camp in the middle of nowhere, with someone else's words pressed against his chest like a compass pointing towards something he did not yet have a name for. He had a name for it now. In the summer of 1883, a young man arrived in Harper Creek. His name was Daniel Morse, and he had come from Missouri with a letter of introduction to the area's landowners from a cattle buyer in Kansas City. He was 24 and ambitious and not unkind, and he arrived at the Vaughn homestead one July afternoon to inquire about purchasing some of the cattle from Jedediah's herd for resale. The business discussion was routine and concluded satisfactorily. What was less routine was the way Daniel Morse looked at Lucy Bishop Vaughn during the conversation, which Lucy either did not notice or chose not to address, and which Jedediah noticed with complete clarity and dismissed with equal completeness, not from jealousy, not really, but from the simple settled certainty of a man who knows where he stands. Afterward, in the evening, Lucy looked up from her journal, where she had been writing with the particular absorbed expression that meant the words were coming well. "You were very quiet during supper," she said. "I was thinking," he said. "About what?" he considered. "About how fortunate I am," he said simply. She set down her pen. She looked at him with full attention, the way she did when something he said reached her properly. "Jedediah Vaughn," she said, "were you feeling jealous of a cattle buyer from Missouri?" He said nothing, which was itself an answer. She set her journal on the table and rose and came to him and sat beside him and put her arm through his and leaned her head against his shoulder in the easy, habitual way of someone who has been doing this for nearly a decade and has never once found it anything other than exactly right. "You found my journal on the prairie," she said. "You could have ridden past it. You could have left it on a rock. You could have read it and kept it or burned it or let the wind take the pages. Instead, you turned your horse around and rode 3 days to put it back in my hands." He covered her hand with his. "A man who does that," she said, "is not a man I am going anywhere from." The prairie wind moved outside against the windows, the autumn wind now, 1883, 9 years after that first afternoon on the Kansas flats. The children were asleep down the hall. Hector, who was 6 and talked endlessly, and Alina, who was nearly 4 and watched everything with those careful, knowing eyes. The fire was low and comfortable in the hearth, and the bookshelf on the east wall held its books in the warm light, and the journal was there among them, small and worn and present. "I love you," he said, "because sometimes the true things need to be spoken plainly, without elegance or elaboration." "I love you," she said, and the simplicity of it was the most honest thing he had ever heard. They sat together in the warm light of their house on the Kansas prairie as the autumn dark moved around them, and the life they had built sat in every corner of the room, in the books and the curtains and the careful woodwork of the shelf and the drawings Hector had made that Lucy had pinned to the wall near the window, and the small pair of Alina's shoes drying by the hearth. A man who finds a journal in the grass and rides 3 days to return it is not performing a great deed. He is doing a small, decent thing, the kind that passes unremarked in the wider world. But the wider world is made of small, decent things, one after another, and the lives that grow from them are not small at all. Jedediah understood this, had come to understand it the way you come to understand the things that matter most, not all at once but over time, one day at a time, one season, one year, the understanding deepening and widening the way a creek deepens after rain. He had a home. He had children. He had a woman beside him whose mind and heart were the most interesting place he had ever been, and who wrote about the world with the precision of someone who intended to leave a record of it worth reading. She was still writing. He was watching her, 2 years later in the autumn of 1885, watching her bent over her journal at the kitchen table in the early morning light while the house was still quiet, and the children not yet awake and the coffee just made and the smell of it and the smell of the autumn air through the cracked window and the scratch of her pen on the page were all part of the same continuous perfect thing. She looked up and caught him watching. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She narrowed her eyes in the way that meant she knew it was not nothing. "I was thinking about that buffalo grass," he said, 60 miles west, that patch of grass where you dropped your journal." She smiled slowly. "I have thought about that spot many times," she said. "I wish I knew exactly where it was." "I could probably find it again," he said, roughly. "Could you?" "A man remembers a place where something significant happened," he said. She set down her pen and looked at him with those eyes that had not changed in 11 years, dark and clear and seeing clearly. "We should take the children there," she said, "someday, to that stretch of prairie or near enough to it, so they know where it was." "Where what was?" he said. "Where their father stopped and picked up a stranger's journal," she said. "Where things began." He thought about it. A family outing to an unmarked stretch of Kansas prairie, to stand in the buffalo grass and say, here, it was somewhere near here. This is where the wind carried the pages and the horse shied, and a man climbed down from the saddle and found words that led him to his life. "All right," he said. "Next spring." She picked up her pen again, smiling, and bent back over the journal. He listened to the scratch of it, and to the morning sounds of the house settling in the early light, and to the distant sound of one of the children stirring down the hall, and to the wind across the grass outside, always the grass, always the wind, the endless and generous Kansas plain that had given him, 10 years ago, the greatest stroke of luck of his life in the form of a book falling from a saddlebag onto the ground at the feet of his horse. He got up and poured her a cup of coffee without being asked, and set it on the table beside her, and she reached up without looking and pressed her hand briefly over his where it rested on the table. Outside, the autumn light was coming up over the flat land, gold and generous and wide. 3 years passed with the easy momentum of years that are full and purposeful, and in the spring of 1888, Jedediah kept the promise made at the kitchen table. He loaded the family into the wagon on a fine April morning, Lucy on the seat beside him with Eleanor at 7 now, and Hector at 11 riding beside the wagon on his own small horse, with the composed pride of a boy who has been deemed responsible enough for the honor. They drove west for 2 days, camping each night on the open prairie with a fire and a good sky overhead, and the children remarkably willing to find the whole enterprise exciting rather than inconvenient. On the second afternoon, Jedediah slowed the wagon and looked out across a broad stretch of buffalo grass that was just beginning to green up with the spring, cut by a slight draw to the north and open in every direction for as far as the eye could carry. "Here," Lucy said, looking around. "Near enough," he said. "This is the right country, could be a mile off in any direction, but the land looks right." They climbed down from the wagon and stood in the spring prairie, the 4 of them, with the wind in the grass and the sky enormous overhead and a meadowlark somewhere close by performing its optimistic song. "Right here," Eleanor said, looking at the ground with the analytical expression she brought to everything. "Or close to right here," Jedediah said. "And you found the book on the ground," Hector said. He had heard the story before several times in the way children request the stories that mean something to them. "And you read it." "Some of it," Jedediah said, "at night by the campfire." "And then you rode 3 days," Hector said. 3 whole days. 3 days, Jedediah confirmed. Hector considered this with the gravity of 11 years. "That's a lot of days," he said. "It was," his father agreed. Eleanor was crouching in the grass looking at it carefully. "Was the journal right here?" she said, touching the ground. "Somewhere near," Jedediah said. "The grass looked the same, buffalo grass this kind." Eleanor picked up a stem of it and turned it in her fingers. She looked up at her mother. "Are you glad he found it?" she said. Lucy looked at her daughter, and then at her son, and then at the man she had married in the Harper Creek Church 14 years ago on an October afternoon, when Pete Holloway's fiddle had made everything sound like celebration. "I am glad," she said, "every single day." Jedediah looked out at the horizon, the way he always did when he was feeling something too large for words. The prairie was the same as it had always been, vast and honest and asking nothing of you except that you be present and real and willing to work. He had found that a reasonable bargain. He reached out and took his wife's hand, there in the spring grass of the Kansas flats, and she leaned into him slightly the way she did, and Eleanor stood up from the grass and came and tucked herself under her mother's other arm, and Hector rode his horse in a slow circle around them with the benevolent indifference of an 11-year-old who finds displays of family feeling simultaneously touching and embarrassing. The meadowlark sang. The wind came through the grass in that particular long sigh it made when nothing was in the way of it, which on the Kansas prairie was almost always. "We should head back north," Jedediah said eventually. "Make camp before dark." "Yes," Lucy said. But neither of them moved for another moment. They stood in the place where it had begun, or near enough to it as to make no difference, and they held all of it in that moment together. The long road from a journal in the grass to a life that was full and warm and real and theirs. Then they turned and went home. The Vaughn homestead stood for many decades, well past the lives of the people who built it. The house was enlarged again in 1891, when a 3rd child arrived, a 2nd son they called James after Lucy's grandfather. A quiet and determined boy who turned out to share his father's gift for working with animals and his mother's gift for paying close attention to the world. Hector Vaughn grew up to take over a portion of the family land and proved to be exactly the capable and decent man his parents had raised him to be. Eleanor Vaughn attended the Teachers College in Wichita in 1899 and returned to Harper Creek to teach at the same school where she had first learned to read, in the same building where her mother had helped build the library shelves. The journal stayed on the bookshelf in the front room for the rest of Lucy's life. She filled 4 more volumes over the years, clear-eyed and honest and vivid, recording the life of a woman on the Kansas prairie with the precision of someone who always understood that the particular is the surest path to the universal. She wrote about everything, the good winters and the hard ones, the seasons of abundance and the seasons of scarcity, the growth of the children and the growth of the town and the growth of the man she had married, who surprised her consistently and in the best possible ways. In the spring of 1903, Lucy Bishop Vaughn sat at the kitchen table of the house that Jedediah had built in 1876 and opened a new journal and wrote on the first page, "My name is Lucy Bishop Vaughn, and I am 51 years old, and the Kansas sky this morning is the particular blue that means everything is exactly as it should be." Jedediah came in from the barn and set his hat on the hook and poured himself coffee and came to sit across from her at the kitchen table, the same table they had sat across from each other at for nearly 30 years, and he asked her what she was writing. "The beginning," she said, and smiled. He poured a cup of coffee and sat across from her and looked out the window at the spring prairie, green and enormous and honest in the morning light, and said, "Tell me." She began to read him what she had written, and he listened the way he had learned to listen over the years, with his full attention, not looking at the words on the page but at the face of the woman reading them, following the movement of her expression as the words moved through her, seeing her think them again as she said them aloud. This was their life. Not a dramatic thing, not a thing that would appear in newspapers or be remarked upon by anyone who did not live it close. An ordinary, extraordinary life, built on an improbable beginning, sustained by two people who had chosen each other with open eyes and stayed with that choice through every season the years could throw at it. Outside, a meadowlark landed on the fence post at the edge of the kitchen garden and began its song, clear and bright, and meant for no audience in particular, and for all audiences at once. The same song that had been sung over this stretch of Kansas grass since long before any human being arrived to hear it, and would go on being sung long after. Jedediah listened to his wife read, and the coffee was warm in his hands, and the spring light moved across the table between them, and the first journal, the worn brown one with the braided cord gone loose at the spine, stood on its shelf against the east wall where he had put it more than 20 years ago and where it had remained, a small monument to the unlikely geography of love, the way it finds you in the most unremarkable of places, in a patch of buffalo grass at the edge of nowhere, in the flutter of pages that catches a horse's attention on a plain October morning, in the moment a man climbs down from the saddle and reaches for something that is not his and decides, without knowing why, that he will ride 3 days to set it right. He would make the same decision again today, tomorrow, every morning for however many mornings remained to him. He pressed his hands around the warm mug and listened to Lucy read. Outside, Kansas spread in every direction, wide and golden and endlessly itself. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.